Thank you for coming and also for all these amazing talks we've seen today. So I'm going to present a sort of high-level overview of some research that tries to bridge this divide between structural or systems-level solutions on the one hand and individual and behavioral-level solutions on the other. Okay, so many of us here spend time thinking about how to rapidly and equitably transform a world that currently looks more like the one on the left to one that will look more like the one on the right. And to do this, there are many different pathways and many different changes that will have to happen. For example, we'll need structural changes to transition our energy, building, and transportation systems to ones that run on renewable energies. We'll also need to consume less meat and fly less. But despite the need for both of these changes, these individual level and structural level changes are often pit against each other in popular discourse. And so these are just some news media articles on the left that have headlines that sort of call for structural level change in lieu of individual level changes. On the right are articles that instead emphasize the need for individual level change, often highlighting the most effective sort of consumer behaviors we can take to reduce our carbon footsteps. This article came out about 2 years ago. It was an influential article in academic circles that makes the case that recently there's been an increased attention to individual level solutions to large-scale policy problems, including climate change, and that these distract and have sort of led policymakers and behavioral scientists astray, distracting them from S-frame or structural level solutions. And so the arguments they make are that a focus on individual level solutions distracts from structural level solutions, or even worse, crowds out structural level solutions, that they're less effective, that individual or behavioral level solutions are less effective, and also that this was part of an intentional corporate strategy aimed at deflecting blame away from their own complicity in these issues. However, I and many other people have argued that this creates a sort of false dichotomy between the two. It sets them up as substitutes where actually they're complements, and they're fundamentally interrelated. So to address climate change, I and several others have argued that we need to address social change at all scales and consider how these scales are integrated. So individuals are embedded in social networks, they're embedded in institutional and physical contexts, and those contexts can amplify individual level changes or behavioral level changes. They can also dampen them. And this is true also for individual behaviors. They can dampen efforts at structural level change. So we need to consider both. We know that some behavioral changes are necessary to mitigate, reduce carbon emissions in hard to mitigate sectors like aviation. And necessary structural change needs public buy-in to be effective. So for example, right now we have a lot of money going into renewable energy development, but there are also a lot of delays, in part due to community opposition to siting. So it's not the case that if you build it, they will necessarily come, or that if you finance it, it will necessarily be built, unless there's also efforts to understand what the public wants and how they want this infrastructure to be rolled out. We also know that individuals affect systems level change. Politics responds to publics, and so groups can demand or impede structural level change. We also know that individuals, when they change their behaviors, their influence doesn't end there. They influence their communities, they influence those around them. They're socially interdependent, and so what feel like small changes can have outsized influence. Finally, by considering individual change as part of an integrated system, we can start to identify leverage points where interventions can drive outsized system-wide change. And so in the next few slides, I'm just going to highlight a few instances that I think might be underappreciated, this integration of individual level change into broader systems-wide change. So first, we know that individuals shape communities, and they're also shaped by the communities they're in. There's a very long literature at this point across many disciplines showing that individual behavior is shaped by the social norms that people perceive around them. And we also heard earlier today in Jeff's talk that some of these sustainable or pro-environmental norms are unknown or even worse, systematically underestimated or misperceived by the public. So this figure that you see on the right is from a recent paper by Nathan Geiger, Greg Sparkman, and Elke Weber that showed they measured public estimates of public support for 5 different climate policies. And what they find is substantial underestimations, those are the little black lines, of the true level of public support for these policies, shown in red. And these underestimations can create what Nathan Geiger has called a climate of silence. They can lead people to self-silence because they don't want to appear counter-normative or to express views that they don't think are popular. And this can also erode collective action. This is one of the reasons that social norm interventions, which we also heard about in several talks earlier today, are particularly effective because they can make these unknown or private behaviors visible. For example, domestic or home energy conservation decisions. There are many interventions at this point that show people information about the efforts their neighbors are taking and find that this influences their own behaviors. The other thing, and this is closer to what I work on, is that this tendency to learn from or coordinate your actions with those around you means that small changes, either circumscribed interventions that change the behaviors of a few, or the efforts of committed minorities, can have ripple effects. They can spread, shifting tipping a society from one norm to another norm. And so this has been called, come up in the literature on social tipping points, and this has been used as a lens to understand moments of rapid historic change, including the recent increase in support for same-sex marriage over the past few decades, how rooftop solar adoption spreads in communities, and also the transition of cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen from car-dependent cities to bike-dominant cities. Okay, second, individuals also shape policy. They shape the institutional context that they're in. Governments and businesses are, to some extent, accountable to their constituents. And public preferences communicated through voting, through petitions, through social movements can shape the decisions of government actors and of businesses. However, so far, these climate actions are not widespread. This is from a nationally representative survey that a student of mine has done where we look at these types of political action, how common they are in the population, and what we find is that they're very infrequent. In light green, you can see the general population compared to a group of environmental activists. They're also much less common than private pro-environmental behaviors like recycling, for example. And this might lead to these misperceptions that we just talked about, or this underestimation of support for climate policies, also among businesses and among political actors. And so in a study, ongoing study funded by RARE, we're finding that after surveying hundreds of local elected officials, that they also substantially underestimate their constituents' support for 7 different climate policies. We also find that they are less likely to underestimate support when they hear more from their constituents through public comments, for example, or when there have been recent environmental protests in their areas. Okay, so we also know that this is the last sort of interdependency that I'll talk about. We also know that policies and the institutional context in turn shape individuals. And I don't just mean through the direct effects that policies have on people's behaviors through regulation, but also through the indirect effects they have through the norms and values that they express. So policies are expressive. Statements by institutions are expressive. And these can quickly lead people to update their understanding of whether pro-environmental norms are common or not. And so in a study where we expose people to information about recent environmental legislation, we see that they quickly update their beliefs, not only about how behaviors will change, but also about support for these policies, about the social norms in their environments. Okay. So I've talked a little bit about how integrating or having a more integrated view of individual level change as part of a systems-wide process of change is important to understand the full impact of interventions and to understand how to design these interventions. It's also important when it comes to the public narratives we have about how social change happens. So in a second study, also ongoing, also funded by RARE, a PhD student and I have looked at the impacts of exposure to these structural level narratives, individualized narratives, and this kind of integrative approach. And what we find is that structural level narratives disincentivize individual pro-environmental behaviors, such as recycling or consuming less meat, and these are both incentivized actual behaviors and behavioral intentions. We also find that individualized narratives disincentivize political actions relative to a mixed or integrative frame, so the types of actions I was speaking about previously. And this happens because these structural and individualized, dichotomized narratives reduce a sense of personal and collective efficacy that people have to be able to address climate change, relative to a more integrated view of social change. Okay, I'm gonna skip that last slide in the interest of time, but hopefully I've convinced you that we need to take a more integrative approach to thinking about how individual level change is one aspect that can reinforce structural level change, can dampen it, and we need to think about them all together as parts of system-wide change if we're going to address a huge issue like climate change. Thank you.